Jake Martinez walked slowly through the tall shelves of books at Barnes & Noble. The afternoon sun came through the big windows and made warm spots on the carpet. He was looking for a book about different religions for his college class. Philosophy section was quiet, with only a few people reading in the soft chairs nearby. Jake stopped in front of a shelf full of books about world religions. He pulled out a thick book about Buddhism and flipped through the pages. The store smelled like coffee and new books. Soft music played from speakers he could not see. Everything felt peaceful and calm. He was reading about meditation when he felt a small tug on his jacket. Jake looked down and saw a little girl with dark curly hair. She had big brown eyes and wore a pink sweater with a small flower on it. In her hands, she held a colorful children's book with Hebrew letters on the cover.
"Excuse me, mister, the
Girl said in a sweet voice. She looked up at him without any fear. "Do you know what Machshavot Tovot means?" Jake was surprised. He had studied Hebrew in his religion class, but he never expected to hear it from such a young child. He put his book back on the shelf and knelt down so he could look at her face to face. "That's a Hebrew phrase," he said with a smile. "Where did you hear those words?" The little girl's face lit up. "My Hebrew school teacher said it yesterday. She told us it was important, but I didn't understand what it meant. My dad was busy talking to other parents, so I couldn't ask him." Notice she spoke very clearly for someone so young. She seemed smart and curious about everything around her. "What's your name?" he asked. "Rebecca Gold," she said. "I'm 8 years old. I go to Temple Beth Shalom with my dad every Friday night." "Nice to meet you, Rebecca. I'm Jake." He looked at the book in her hands. It had pictures of Jewish holidays and traditions. "That's a nice book you have there." Rebecca held it up proudly. "My dad bought it for me last week. It has stories about Hanukkah and Passover, but there's some words I don't know yet." Jake felt happy that this young girl wanted to learn about her heritage. In his religion classes, he had learned that Jewish culture valued education and asking questions. Rebecca seemed like a perfect example of this tradition. "Kafa de Tovo means good thoughts," Jake explained slowly. In Hebrew, Machshavot means thoughts that come from your mind, means good or positive. So when you put them together, it means thinking good things about people and situations. Rebecca's eyes grew wide with understanding. "Like when my teacher gets angry because we're too loud, I should think good thoughts about her instead of being mad?" "Exactly," Jake said. He was impressed by how quickly she understood the concept. It's about trying to see the best in people and situations, even when things seem difficult. "Oh, that makes sense," Rebecca said, nodding her head. "My grandma always tells me to look for the good in everything. She says it makes life happier." Jake smiled. He could tell Rebecca came from a family that cared about teaching her important values. "Your grandma sounds very wise." Rebecca opened her book and showed Jake a page with Hebrew letters and English translations. "There are lots of words in here I don't know. My dad helps me sometimes, but he works a lot. He's a lawyer and he has to read big books for his job." "A lawyer sounds like hard work," Jake said. "But I bet your dad likes helping you learn new things." "He does," Rebecca said happily. "He tells me stories about our family and why these traditions are important. Says asking questions is the best way to learn." Jake looked around the bookstore. He noticed a few other people browsing nearby, but no one seemed to be looking. "For Rebecca, where is your dad now?" he asked, feeling a little concerned. "He's looking at books about law stuff." Rebecca pointed toward another section of the store. He said I could look at the children's books, but I wanted to find books about Jewish things instead. Jake understood why Rebecca had wandered over to the religion section. She was curious and wanted to learn more about her culture. He respected her independence, but he also knew her father might be worried if he couldn't find her. "Maybe we should go find your dad," Jake suggested. "Like to meet him, and I'm sure he'd want to know where you are." Rebecca nodded. "Okay, he's really smart about Jewish things. He went to Hebrew school when he was little too. Maybe he can explain more words to both of us." As they started walking toward the other section, Rebecca kept talking. "Do you go too?" "Temple?" she asked Jake. Double quotes, "No, I don't," Jake said honestly. "But I study different religions in college. I think it's important to learn about how different people believe and live." "That's cool," Rebecca said. My dad says it's good to learn about other people's beliefs too. His friends who are Christian and Muslim and Buddhist. He says we can all learn from each other. Jake was impressed by the wisdom this little girl shared. Her family clearly taught her to be open-minded and respectful of others. As they walked through the store, Rebecca continued asking questions about different religions and cultures. Do you think Machshavot Tovot works for everyone? She asked. Even people who aren't Jewish? Jake thought about her question carefully. I think the idea of having good thoughts is something that can help anyone, no matter what they believe. Many religions and philosophies teach similar ideas about being positive and kind. Rebecca smiled. I like that. It means everyone can try to think good thoughts together. They reached the law section where several adults were reading thick books with serious expressions. Jake scanned the area, looking for someone who might be Rebecca's father. He hoped they would find him soon, and he was curious to meet the man. Who had raised such a thoughtful and articulate daughter? Rebecca tugged on his jacket again. There he is, she said, pointing to a tall man with dark hair who was reading a book about constitutional law. The man looked up just then, and his eyes immediately found Rebecca. Relief and concern crossed his face as he saw his daughter with a stranger. David Gold closed his book quickly when he saw Rebecca standing with a young man he did not know. His heart beat faster as he walked toward them. As a father, his first thought was to protect his daughter. He had taught Rebecca to be friendly. But he had also warned her about talking to strangers. Rebecca, David called out as he got closer. His voice was calm but firm. There you are. I was looking for you. Rebecca ran to her father with a big smile. Dad, this is Jake. He knows what Machshavot Tovot means. He explained it to me really well. David looked at Jake carefully. The young man seemed nice enough, but David needed to understand what had happened. He put his hand gently on Rebecca's shoulder and studied Jake's face. A student, maybe 20 or 21 years old. He wore jeans and a simple blue shirt. He seemed nervous, but not in a bad way. Hello, David, said to Jake. I'm David Gold, Rebecca's father. He did not smile yet, but his voice was polite. Jake stood up straighter and extended his hand. Nice to meet you, Mr. Gold. I'm Jake Martinez. Your daughter asked me about a Hebrew phrase while I was looking at books in the religion section. David shook Jake's hand. He noticed Jake's grip was firm, and his eye contact was direct. These were good signs? What phrase was that? David asked. Machshavot Tovot, Rebecca said, before Jake could answer. Jake told me it means good thoughts. Said it's about thinking positive things about people and situations, even when things are hard. David's expression softened a little. He was impressed that Jake knew Hebrew and could explain the concept clearly to a child. Not many college students would take time to have a serious conversation with an 8-year-old girl about Jewish philosophy. That's a very good explanation, David said to Jake. Are you studying Hebrew? I'm taking a comparative religion course. At the university, Jake explained, we've been learning about different faith traditions and their core teachings. I found the Jewish emphasis on questioning and learning really interesting. David felt his guard dropping. Jake seemed genuinely interested in learning, not just showing off his knowledge. Rebecca was bouncing on her toes, excited to share more of her conversation with her father. Dad, Jake studies lots of different religions, Rebecca said. He knows about Buddhism and Christianity and Islam too. He said the idea of thinking good thoughts can help everyone, not just Jewish people. David smiled for the first time since finding them together. Is that right? He asked Jake. What made you interested in studying different religions? Jake relaxed when he saw David's friendlier expression. I grew up in a small town where almost everyone was Catholic, Jake said. When I came to college, I met people from all different backgrounds. I realized I didn't know much about other ways of thinking about life and meaning. I wanted to understand how different people find purpose in community. That's a mature perspective, David said. He appreciated that Jake was honest about his background and his reasons for studying. Rebecca loves learning about our traditions, but she also asks questions that sometimes challenge what she's taught. I noticed that, Jake said with a smile. She asked if Machshavot Tovot works for people who aren't Jewish. It showed me she's really thinking about how ideas connect to the bigger world. Rebecca beamed with pride. She loved when adults recognized that her questions were serious and important. Jake said many religions teach about being positive and kind, she told her father. Is that true, Dad? David looked thoughtful. This was exactly the kind of conversation he enjoyed having with Rebecca. He wanted her to understand that Jewish wisdom was valuable, but he also wanted her to see how it connected to universal human values. It is true, David said. Different traditions express these ideas in different ways, but many of them share similar goals. We want people to be kind, to help others, and to make the world better. Jake nodded. In my class, we've seen that themes like compassion, justice, and positive thinking appear in many different forms across cultures. The specific practices and beliefs might be different, but the underlying human concerns are often similar. That's exactly right, David said. He was becoming more impressed with Jake's understanding. Jewish tradition teaches us to ask questions and to engage with ideas, not just accept them blindly. It sounds like your studies are helping you do the same thing. Rebecca listened carefully to their conversation. She understood most of what they were saying, and she liked seeing her father talk with someone who shared his interest in learning. And thinking, Dad, Rebecca said, could we invite Jake to come to temple sometime? Maybe he could learn more about our traditions, and we could learn about what he's studying too. David was surprised by his daughter's suggestion, but he thought it was a good idea. Jake seemed like a genuine person who would respect their traditions and ask thoughtful questions. Would you be interested in that? David asked Jake. We attend Friday evening services at Temple Beth Shalom. It's a welcoming community, and Rabbi Sarah often encourages questions and discussion during her talks. Jake's face lit up. I would really like that, he said. I've read about Jewish worship and traditions, but I've never experienced them firsthand. I would be honored to be your guest. Great, David said. Why don't you give me your contact information, and I'll let you know about this Friday's service. As Jake wrote down his phone number and email address, Rebecca continued talking. Jake, you should also meet my grandma Ruth. She knows lots of stories about our family and about Jewish history. She loves when people ask her questions. I'd like that very much, Jake said. He handed David a piece of paper with his information written clearly. David looked at the paper and then at Jake. Jake, this conversation has been really refreshing. It's not often that Rebecca gets to share her curiosity with someone who takes her questions seriously and can engage with the ideas behind them. She's a remarkable young lady, Jake said sincerely. She asks the kinds of questions that show she's really thinking about what she learns, not just memorizing facts. Rebecca hugged her father's arm. Can we keep talking about Machshavot Tovot and other Jewish ideas? I have more questions. David laughed. Of course we can. That's what these teachings are for, to help us think and grow and understand our place in the world. Jake felt grateful for this unexpected encounter. What had started as a simple question from a curious child had turned into a meaningful conversation with a thoughtful father and daughter. Looked forward to learning more about their community and sharing his own journey of discovery with them. David looked at his daughter and Jake, both waiting to hear more about Machshavot Tovot. He realized this was a perfect teaching moment, not just for Rebecca, but for Jake too. David had always loved explaining Jewish concepts, but he rarely had such an eager audience outside of his family. David said, settling into a more comfortable position by leaning against the bookshelf. Machshavot Tovot is more than just thinking positive thoughts. It's actually a powerful tool that can change your entire life. Rebecca sat down on the carpet, crossing her legs, like she did during story time at home. Jake remained standing, but moved closer, clearly interested in hearing more. Let me tell you about a case I worked on last year, David began. His voice became warmer and more animated as he spoke. I was defending a man named Carlos Rivera, who's accused of stealing money from the company where he worked. Everyone believed he was guilty, including some people in my own law firm. Noticed how David's whole posture changed when he started telling his story. The careful, protective father had transformed into a confident speaker who commanded attention. The evidence looked bad for Carlos, David continued. Security cameras showed him near the office safe. He had money problems at home. His own co-workers testified that he had been acting nervous for weeks before the theft was discovered. Rebecca listened with wide eyes. She had heard her father talk about his work before, but never in such detail. Did you think he was guilty too, Dad? She asked. David smiled at his daughter. That's exactly the right question, Rebecca. At first, I wasn't sure. The prosecutor had a strong case. But then I remembered what my grandfather taught me about Machshavot Tovot. Jake leaned forward. What did your grandfather teach you? Told me that when we assume the worst about people, we stop looking for the truth, David said. He said that Machshavot Tovot doesn't mean being naive or ignoring facts. It means choosing to believe that people are capable of good, and that there might be explanations we haven't considered yet. David's voice became more passionate as he continued. So instead of preparing a defense based on the assumption that Carlos was guilty, I decided to investigate as if he was innocent. I spent weeks talking to him, learning about his family, understanding his character. What did you find out? Jake asked. He was completely absorbed in the story. I discovered that Carlos was nervous because his wife was pregnant with their first child. And she was having complications, David explained. He had been leaving work early for doctor appointments and staying up all night worrying. That's why he seemed distracted and anxious. Rebecca clapped her hands together. So he wasn't stealing money at all? Not only was he not stealing, David said with a grin, but when I investigated further with the assumption that Carlos was innocent, I found the real thief. It was the office manager who had been stealing small amounts for months. She knew how to manipulate the security system and had been framing Carlos to cover her own crimes. Jake shook his head in amazement. That's incredible. So practicing Machshavot Tovot actually led you to solve the case. Exactly, David said. If I had focused on trying to minimize Carlos's punishment while assuming he was guilty, I never would have looked deeper. The real criminal would have gotten away, and an innocent man would have gone to prison. A woman browsing nearby books had started listening to David's story. She moved closer, pretending to look at books but clearly. Paying attention to the conversation, David noticed her interest but didn't stop talking. This experience taught me that Machshavot Tovot isn't just a nice idea. It's a practical approach to life that can reveal truths that negative thinking hides from us. Dad, does this work for other things too? Rebecca asked. Not just lawyer stuff. David's eyes lit up. This was exactly the kind of question he loved from his daughter. Oh yes, Rebecca. It works for everything. Remember when you were upset because your teacher, Mrs. Johnson, gave you a lower grade on your art project? Rebecca nodded. I thought she didn't like my painting. But when we practiced Machshavot Tovot, what did we discover? Eva asked. That she wanted to help me learn to pay more attention to details, Rebecca said proudly. And when I talked to her about it, she showed me how to make my next painting even better. Jake was impressed by how David connected the philosophical concept to real-life examples that both a child and an adult could understand. You're a natural teacher, Mr. Gold, he said. David felt a warm glow from Jake's compliment. Thank you. I've always enjoyed explaining ideas and helping people see new perspectives. In law school, my friends used to joke that I should have been a rabbi instead of a lawyer. The woman who had been listening stepped closer. Excuse me, she said politely. I couldn't help but overhear your story about the innocent man you defended. That was beautiful. You giving a talk here today? David looked surprised. Oh no. We were just having a conversation about Jewish philosophy. My daughter asked a question that led to this discussion. Well, you should consider giving talks, the woman said. I'm Linda Watson, and I organize community education events at the library. You have a gift for making complex ideas accessible and interesting. 2 other people had also started listening. An elderly man with a cane had sat down in a nearby chair, and a young mother with a baby in a stroller had stopped to listen while her child slept. Jake realized that David's natural enthusiasm and storytelling ability were drawing people in. Without him even trying, Rebecca looked amazed to see strangers interested in her father's explanations. The thing about Machshavot Tovot, David continued, now speaking to the small group that had gathered, is that it requires courage. It's often easier and feels safer to assume the worst about situations and people. But when we choose to look for the good, we open ourselves up to possibilities we never would have imagined. The elderly man nodded. My wife used to say something similar. She always told me to give people the benefit of the doubt. I thought it was just being nice, but you're describing it as a strategy for discovering truth. That's exactly right, David said warmly. Your wife understood something profound. Machshavot Tovot isn't about being naive or ignoring red flags. It's about approaching life with the assumption that there's more good than bad in the world. What? And that understanding usually leads to better outcomes than suspicion. The small group that had formed around David continued to grow as his passionate explanation drew more curious listeners. Word spread quickly through the bookstore that something interesting was happening in the philosophy section. A teenage employee named Mark was restocking shelves nearby when he heard David's story about Carlos Rivera. Mark stopped his work and listened, then quietly told his coworker Susan about the man telling amazing stories about Jewish wisdom. Susan walked over during her break and found herself drawn into David's explanation of how positive thinking had practical applications in everyday life. Soon, she was telling customers at the information desk that there was an inspiring speaker near the religion books. David was not aware of the growing attention at first. He was focused on answering questions from the original small group. The elderly man with the cane, whose name was Harold, had started sharing his own stories about how his late wife's optimistic approach to life had helped their family through difficult times. My wife Eleanor always said that every person has a good reason for what they do, even when it doesn't look that way, Harold said. I used to think she was too trusting, but now I see that her way of thinking helped her understand people better than I did. David nodded enthusiastically. That's exactly what I'm talking about, Harold. Your wife understood that Machshavot Tovot is really about wisdom. When we assume good intentions, we ask better questions and find better solutions. Rebecca sat on the carpet, watching more and more people gather around her father. She felt proud and excited to see so many adults interested in what he had to say. A family with 2 young boys had joined the group, and the children sat near Rebecca. Listening quietly, Jake noticed that at least 15 people were now listening to David's explanations. Some stood in a circle around him. Others sat in the comfortable reading chairs that were scattered throughout the section. A few people had pulled books from the shelves to sit on. Mr. Gold, said Linda Watson, the woman who organized library events, could you tell us more about how this concept applies to parenting? I have 3 teenagers at home, and I sometimes struggle with assuming the best about their behavior. David's face brightened. This was a topic he was passionate about. Linda, that's such an important question. Rebecca and I practice Machshavot Tovot together all the time, don't we, sweetheart? Rebecca nodded eagerly. What? When I get in trouble at school, or when I'm upset about something, Dad helps me think about why other people might be acting the way they are. Can you give us an example, Rebecca? Linda asked kindly. Rebecca stood up, feeling confident with so many people listening to her. Last month, my friend Emma stopped talking to me at lunch. I thought she was mad at me for something I did wrong. I felt really sad and angry. David smiled encouragingly at his daughter. What did we do when Rebecca told me about this situation? Dad asked me to think of good reasons why Emma might be quiet, Rebecca continued. At first I didn't want to because I was upset. Then I remembered that Emma's parents were getting divorced, and maybe she was sad about that instead of mad at me. The young mother with the baby stroller leaned forward. What happened when you talked to Emma? She started crying and told me that her dad was moving out of their house, Rebecca said. She wasn't mad at me at all. She was just too sad to talk to anyone. After that, I tried to help her feel better, and we became even better friends. Several people in the group nodded and smiled. David could see that Rebecca's simple story had touched them deeply. This is what I mean about Machshavot Tovot, being practical wisdom, David said. If Rebecca had assumed Emma was angry with her, she might have gotten angry back, or avoided Emma completely, instead by assuming there was a good reason for Emma's behavior. Rebecca was able to help a friend in need. A man in a business suit who had been listening for several minutes spoke up. This reminds me of something that happened at my office. I had an employee who started making mistakes and missing deadlines. My first instinct was to assume he was being lazy or careless. What did you do? Jake asked. Well, I didn't know about this Machshavot Tovot concept then, the man said with a rueful smile. I criticized him pretty harshly. Later, I found out his mother had been diagnosed with cancer, and he was spending his evenings driving her to treatments. I felt terrible about not asking if everything was okay before assuming the worst. David nodded sympathetically. That's a perfect example of how our assumptions shape our actions. If you had started with the assumption that he had a good reason for the changes in his work, you might have discovered the situation sooner and been able to help. The bookstore manager, a woman named Lisa Thompson, had been watching the growing crowd from behind the information desk. She walked over to see what was drawing so much attention. When she arrived, she found David in the middle of explaining how Jewish tradition encourages questioning and learning as ways to grow closer to truth and wisdom. In Jewish culture, we have a saying, David was telling the group. It goes, who is wise? The one who learns from every person. This connects directly to Machshavot Tovot, because when we assume people have something valuable to teach us, we become better learners. Lisa was impressed by David's natural speaking ability and the engaged attention of his audience. People were asking thoughtful questions, sharing their own experiences, and genuinely connecting with each other around the ideas David was presenting. Excuse me, Lisa said during a pause in the conversation. I'm Lisa Thompson, the manager here. I couldn't help but notice the wonderful discussion you're leading. Have you ever considered giving formal presentations about these topics? David looked surprised. I'm just a lawyer who enjoys talking about ideas with my daughter and anyone else who's interested. Well, you're a natural teacher, Lisa said. We host community education events here once a month. Would you be interested in giving a talk about Jewish wisdom and its practical applications? I think a lot of people in our community would benefit from hearing these ideas. The crowd around David murmured their agreement. Several people said they would definitely attend such an event. Harold raised his cane slightly and said, I'd be first in line for that talk. Rebecca tugged on her father's sleeve. Dad, you should do it. You're really good at explaining things so people can understand them. David looked around at the faces surrounding him. Young and old, different backgrounds and experiences, but all unified by their interest in learning and growing, realized that his love for teaching and sharing ideas could reach far beyond his family and close friends. You know what? David said with growing excitement. I think I'd really like to try that. 3 weeks later, Jake walked into Barnes & Noble with a notebook and pen in his hand. He had been thinking about his conversation with David and Rebecca every day since their first meeting. The ideas they had shared about Machshavot Tovot had changed how he approached his studies and his relationships with other people, he found. David and Rebecca sitting at a small table near the philosophy section. Rebecca was reading a new book about Jewish holidays, and David was making notes on a legal pad. When they saw Jake approaching, both of them smiled widely. Jake, Rebecca called out, jumping up from her chair. Dad's been preparing for his big talk next week. So excited. He's been practicing on me and Grandma Ruth every night. Jake sat down at their table. How are the preparations going, Mr. Gold? Please call me David, David said warmly. They're going well, thanks to Rebecca's help. She keeps asking me questions that make me think about how to explain things more clearly. Rebecca beamed with pride. I'm going to introduce Dad at his talk. Lisa said I could tell everyone how this whole thing started with my question about Machshavot Tovot. Jake was amazed at how confident Rebecca had become. The shy curiosity she had shown 3 weeks ago had grown into genuine enthusiasm for sharing ideas with others. That's wonderful, Jake said. I've been telling my classmates about our conversation. A professor even asked me to write a paper about how different religious traditions approach positive thinking. David looked interested. How's that going? It's really well, Jake said. I've been researching how Buddhism talks about right thinking, how Christianity discusses having faith and hope, and how Islam teaches about having good intentions. It's fascinating to see how many cultures have developed similar ideas. Exactly what I hoped you would discover, David said. One of the beautiful things about studying different traditions is seeing how human wisdom appears in many forms across different communities. Rebecca looked up from her book. Jake R. You going to write about our talk in your paper? I already did, Jake said with a smile. I wrote about how a simple question from an 8-year-old girl led to a discussion that taught me more about practical wisdom than any textbook ever had. Just then, Harold, the elderly man with the cane from their first meeting, walked slowly over to their table. He'd been coming to the bookstore every few days, hoping to catch them for another conversation. "There you are," Harold said happily. "I was hoping I'd find you all here today. I wanted to tell you what happened when I tried that Machshavot Tovot approach with my neighbor." David gestured for Harold to sit down. "Please, tell us what happened." Harold settled into the empty chair with a satisfied sigh. "You know how I've been complaining about my neighbor Tom for months. His dog barks early in the morning, and I was convinced he was just being inconsiderate." Rebecca put down her book to listen. She loved hearing how the ideas they talked about helped people in real life. Instead of marching over there to complain again, Harold continued, "I decided to assume Tom had a good reason for not controlling his dog's barking. So I brought him some cookies my daughter made and asked if everything was okay." "What did you find out?" Jake asked. Harold's eyes grew soft. "Turns out Tom's been getting up at 5 in the morning to take care of his elderly mother who has dementia. She lives with him now, and she gets confused and scared during the night. The dog barks because it senses her distress and is trying to comfort her." David nodded thoughtfully. "So the dog wasn't being a nuisance, it was actually being protective and caring." "Exactly," Harold said. "And now, instead of being angry neighbors, Tom and I are friends. I help him watch his mother sometimes when he needs to run errands. His dog doesn't seem like a problem anymore, because I understand why it barks." Rebecca clapped her hands together. "It's so nice, Harold. You help someone instead of being mad at them. I learned that from you and your father, sweetheart." Harold said to Rebecca, "Your question about Machshavot Tovot started something special." Lisa Thompson, the bookstore manager, approached their table, carrying a clipboard and wearing an excited expression. "David, I'm so glad you're here. I wanted to update you on the response to your upcoming talk." "Good news, I hope?" David asked. "Very good news," Lisa said. "We've had over 60 people sign up already. I've had to move the event to our largest meeting room, and I'm still getting calls from people who want to attend." Jake was impressed. 60 people? That's amazing. What's even more amazing, Lisa continued, is the variety of people who are interested. We have college students like Jake, parents wanting to learn better communication with their children, business professionals looking for leadership insights, and seniors like Harold who want to improve their relationships with neighbors and family. Rebecca looked up at her father with admiration. "Dad, you're going to help so many people learn about thinking good thoughts." David felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "I hope I can live up to their expectations." "You will," said a familiar voice behind them. They all turned to see Linda Watson, the woman who organized library events. She was carrying a small recording device. "David, I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to let me record your talk. The library would like to create a podcast series about practical wisdom from different cultural traditions." David looked surprised. "A podcast? I never imagined anything like that." "Your approach to explaining complex ideas in simple, relatable ways is exactly what people are looking for," Linda said. "After the podcast of your talk, I'd love to have you back to discuss other Jewish concepts, and maybe we could invite speakers from other traditions too." Jake leaned forward eagerly. "That sounds like it could become something really special. A whole series about wisdom traditions and how they apply to modern life." Rebecca tugged on her father's sleeve. "Dad, remember what you always tell me about trying new things?" David smiled at his daughter. "What do I tell you?" "That the best way to learn is to say yes to opportunities that help other people," Rebecca said proudly. Harold chuckled. "Sounds like you've got your answer right there, David." David looked around the table at the faces of people who had become friends through their shared interest in learning and growing. 3 weeks ago, he had been a busy lawyer who enjoyed discussing ideas with his daughter. Now he was discovering a passion for teaching that he never knew he had. "You know what?" David said, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "Let's do it. Podcast, the regular talks, all of it." If Rebecca's simple question about Machshavot Tovot can bring together this many people who want to learn and help each other, then maybe we're onto something important. Rebecca jumped up and hugged her father. "This is going to be so much fun, Dad. We can teach people together." Jake smiled as he watched the scene unfold. A curious 8-year-old's question had indeed started something special, and he felt grateful to be part of it from the very beginning.